Thank you for the invitation and thank you for having me. So the plan for today's talk, what I want to do is I want to give you kind of an update of what has been going on in terms of data mining graphs in our group and how have we been thinking about this, and I plan to cover different topics well beyond kind of different approaches to graph mining, but also different types of applications. Why do I like graphs, or why do I like networks? Because the way I see networks is they're a super nice modeling language for any kind of complex system, any kind of interacting system. You want to start modeling it as graphs, and then you want to start analyzing, data mining those graphs, right? So kind of networks are this common mathematical representation, the common language that many different domains, many different areas kind of boil down to, right? So if I want to understand the plots of the stories in a given movie, I can start creating actor collaborations or actor interaction graphs. If I want to understand social networks and social relationships, I can start creating social networks and analyzing them, right? And if I want to understand biology and how life works, I can create networks of, let's say, proteins, how they physically meet and interact in the cell, and start analyzing this type of data. And kind of the beautiful thing is that at the end, the same algorithm allows me to analyze any kind of network, regardless whether it's a social network of humans or if it's a kind of a social network of proteins, if you want to think of it that way, right? And that's kind of the interesting and fascinating about this. And today I'll show you examples, I think, at all levels, from nodes being molecules all the ways to nodes being humans. So I will just jump in and kind of tell you what my talk today is about. So what I will do is I will talk about four different things when you think about computing with networks. First is just what kind of infrastructure do you need, and what has our group been using to work with graph data. Then I will give you a quick idea about how can you infer and build networks from raw data, actually from raw time series. Then we will be talking very briefly about feature learning or machine learning on networks. And then the last things will be some new ideas about how can you go and identify modules or communities or clusters in networks. Okay, so that's the idea, and I'll post the slides after the talk with all the references and everything. Okay, so the first thing is how do we compute over graph data? And here I want to just give kind of a quick overview of what our group has been doing and how we are releasing code and making it available to the community together with data sets. And our website is getting more than 1 million hits a year. So it's kind of a go-to reference for graph and network data. So the way we think about end-to-end graph analytics is kind of to start with the raw data, create, infer, build networks, and then apply data mining in order to extract new knowledge and new insights. And this means that you kind of need a system that's flexible, scalable, and allows for easy implementation of new algorithms. And basically, every research paper we publish is developed on top of our code base that then we make publicly available. So our code base we call SNAP, for Stanford Network Analysis Platform, and it's basically a general purpose, easy to use, but still high performance system for manipulation and analysis of networks. And the bottom layer is all implemented in C++ under the BSD license, so anyone can take it and kind of do whatever they want with it. And we can easily scale to networks with hundreds of millions of nodes and billions of edges. And for most practical purposes, that's more than enough. Traditionally, there has been a problem of, oh, but what hardware do you use? How do you distribute this over a Hadoop cluster and things like that? And the thing is, we don't. We use large-scale memory machines. We have servers with 1 terabyte of memory and about 80 cores. Those are today relatively cheap. I think you can get one for about $20,000. We had them since 2009. The biggest machine we have in our group right now is a box with 12 terabytes of memory and about 300 cores. So for the biggest networks, we use that. But kind of the point is that the amount of available RAM is increasing faster than the amount of available data. I think the KDD Nuggets does a yearly survey of what was the biggest data set you analyzed and what's the biggest machine you have, and extrapolating, it's kind of overtaking. So the bottom line is, for graphs, because it's very hard to distribute them, it comes with lots of overheads, we use big machines. And we use that at Pinterest a lot as well. I can talk about that kind of offline. Okay, so what about now? So now you have the hardware, how do you build the software? The way we build the software is to realize that there are many different containers that can store graphs as network, as relational information, because graphs can be directed, undirected, they can have data or metadata associated with nodes and edges, so you want to have very flexible containers. These containers still need to be a bit specialized because otherwise you have too big performance overheads. But these containers need to be standardized so that any algorithm you build works on any graph container. So the way we design our software is to have these graph containers that store the raw graph data, and then have general algorithms, methods that work on any of the containers. And another thing that becomes important is to also have like a small subsystem that allows you to load in relational tables and manipulate them to create graphs. So you can take raw data, create graphs, and then start analyzing those graphs. And of course, you need to be able to dump them on disk, and then you also need something for the user to see. And for the user, we have a Python front end where they can write Python code that at the bottom then the C++ code gets executed. Okay, so how do we break out these graph analytic methods? There are kind of three pieces to it, right? First is that you want to be able to generate synthetic graphs and synthetic models so that you can have null models. You want to manipulate graphs in terms of extracting subgraphs, identifying connected components, and so on. And then you want to do analytics. And internally, we think of graphs as just the wiring diagrams and networks as graphs with associated data. And we can do both. And overall, we have over 200 graph algorithms implemented in this code base. So kind of to just highlight, the user front end is all in C++. At the back end, it's all, the user facing module is all in Python, so it's kind of easy and fast to use. The back end is all in C++, so it's scalable. And the code is parallelized using OpenMP, and we have very fast hash table and vector operators, so that things work really well. And just to show you kind of one simple example, here is published benchmarks on this Twitter graph that's about 1 billion edges. It's actually nothing too big. It fits into about 10 gigabytes of memory. And here are different graph processing systems, how big machines and how big clusters they use, and this is one iteration of PageRank, right? And the Snap implementation, which is kind of just straight C++, nothing too special, single machine, you're at around 6 seconds. And that's, you know, compare that to Power Graph with a cluster of 64 and other things like that, right? So these things are actually quite competitive and quite useful for majority of the tasks we do, except for the kind of the biggest possible graphs. Okay, so that's the first thing I want to do, and this is all publicly available, and if you'd like to contribute to your algorithms and code, we'd be very happy to take them. Good, so first thing out of the way. The second problem, how do you go and build and infer networks? And we've been thinking about this quite a lot, and we have a SIGMOD paper last year talking about this, but here I actually want to give a quick insight into what we've been doing recently in terms of time series data, and this is actually a paper that's going to appear here at the conference later this week. Okay, so kind of the realization is that when you work with data or when you work with graphs, graphs are never given, but they need to be inferred from the raw data. In some sense, graph generation or graph building is part of the knowledge discovery process. So you need to be able to identify what are the relationships, what are the entities, and then build networks. And the way we started this project was actually to go to a very different domain and start asking, okay, how could you extract graph structure from data? And we started talking to people who are building big machines, for example, car manufacturers, people in biomedicine, and kind of smart cities people who have lots and lots of sensors data, but they don't understand what is the structure and kind of what are the modes of operation in these large sensor arrays. So basically we started with this idea of, can I use large-scale multi-dimensional time series data to start understanding what is the structure in this time series data. And the way you can encode structure is to encode it with networks, right? So the idea is, can I encode structure and dependencies in temporal data through taking sensors as nodes and somehow having two sensors be connected if they are related, okay? So what do we do? The idea is relatively simple. The idea is that on the input you are getting this time series flowing in. Let's say here I have 3 different time series, 3 different sensors. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to segment this time series into different regimes. Here we segment it into 3 different regimes. And then for each of these regimes, I would like to uncover the dependency network between different sensors. And dependency network, you can think of it as some kind of correlation network. At the end, what we are inferring is inverse covariance matrices. So basically we infer inverse covariances between sensors, which basically means we uncover an edge means that 2 sensors are dependent, and an absence of an edge means that 2 sensors are independent given everything else in the network. So there's kind of a nice statistical interpretation to this. Right? So now the question is, how can we go and infer these types of networks from input data where the number of different inputs is an order of 10,000? Okay, so the way we formulate the problem is, given a set of time series data, I want to learn a dependency network. And a dependency network for me is estimate the inverse covariance matrix theta, where the nice thing is, if the edge is absent in the network, so if theta ij is 0, then I is conditionally independent of j. Right? And what is interesting is that I don't want to infer just one network, but I want to, in some sense, infer a series of networks, or I want to allow these networks to evolve over time. Right? And this way I can gain insights into kind of processes and detect anomalies that are happening in this unsupervised, unlabeled time series data. Okay? Our method we call time-varying graphical lasso, where on the input we get this high-dimensional time series data, and on the output our goal is to infer a sequence of networks, which essentially are inverse covariance matrices, and the idea is that I want to segment the time series and infer a network for each time segment. Notice that this has a huge number of parameters. If I have capital N sensors and t time steps, then I'm essentially inferring something of an order of n squared times t different things, right? N squared is the network at a given time, and for every time step I want to kind of infer a network. The way we encode this into a large optimization problem is the following. Is basically, we want to minimize the following kind of equation that has three terms, and I'll explain to them. So the one on the left, L sub I, that's the likelihood. It says, how well does the network at time I, how well does it refer to the underlying measurements, to the underlying data. So that's the likelihood of data at time I. Then the second term, where I have the lambda, that's the sparsity penalty, where basically I say the networks I want to infer, I want them to be sparse. I want most of the entries of my network of theta to be 0. And then the last part, the one with beta, that's the temporal consistency part, where I say that 2 consecutive networks at time I and time I minus 1, they have to be similar, right? The distance between the 2 adjacency matrices has to be small. Okay, so now what becomes interesting is what do I mean by this temporal consistency penalty? What kind of penalties can I choose? And what becomes interesting is that you can choose different penalties depending on kind of what is your belief or what is your hypothesis about the evolution of this network. Right, so for example, you can design a special penalty, as I have it here, if what you want to allow is between time steps only single edges to rewire, kind of a small number of edges to change between consecutive time steps. For example, we can also design penalties. I don't show them down here because kind of equations are too long, but we can also design penalties where you basically say the network remains constant, and then I allow a single node to rewire all its connections. Or if you want to do this kind of change point detection, we have developed a different penalty that allows you kind of to say the network, I expect the network to be constant, static, and then everything can change at the same time. And and I don't incur any penalty regardless of how much the network changes. Right? So in some sense you can encode
your modeling assumptions about the evolution of these networks through these temporal consistency functions and the way they measure the similarity in some sense between two consecutive networks. Okay, so that's high-level idea. So now the next question is, how do I go and compute this? And the way we solve this equation I had 2 slides ago is that we represent the optimization problem as a graph. Okay, so in this way, in this case, we will represent our optimization problem as a long chain graph, where for every time step we have a node, and every node is trying to solve its own optimization problem, which is basically determine a network structure at that node. And then we have these temporal consistency penalties parameters as objective functions on the edges. And edges connect two consecutive networks, 2 consecutive time steps. So this network, the number of nodes will be the number of time steps, where for every time step I want to infer a network, and between the nodes, the edges, they say that 2 consecutive networks have to be similar according to this temporal consistency penalty function I was just talking about. What is nice is that now if I represent my optimization problem this way, I can basically use message passing algorithms to do convex optimization on top of these graphs. And we have developed a distributed ADMM optimization solver that allows us to do this, where basically the idea is that without any global coordination, this message passing algorithm will quickly converge to the optimal solution. And we have this, again, the solver by itself is available for people to download and solve their own optimization problems with it. We just chose to use our solver for this particular problem. To show you how well this works, I'm plotting here the number of parameters, the number of unknowns on the x-axis, and the time to solution, time to optimize my equation on the y-axis for different optimization solvers. CVXOpt, kind of a naive implementation of ADMM, all the way to our own implementation. And basically the point is that we can solve convex optimization problems with tens of million, or of an order of 10 million parameters in less than an hour, in about like 20 minutes or so, 1,000 seconds. And just kind of to show one applications of this is, we were motivated to start this research after talking to car manufacturers, because basically cars have lots of sensors. A typical Audi would have around 2,000 sensors, but it's very hard for these manufacturers to even understand what is happening in the car as the person drives it. So this particular company hired students back in Germany to drive around and collect data. So we were able to get that anonymized data and started asking, can I infer this dynamic dependency network and use them as signatures of the state of the car, or what is happening with the car, to both kind of understand driving style, identify drivers, detect when drivers are drunk or distracted or drowsy, things like that. And just one small example of what you can do is, for example, here I'm showing you 3 different dependency networks between sensors that are denoted as nodes, where this is just a small subpart of the dependency network around when a person makes a turn. These are the names of the sensors, and these are the dependency between the sensors. And you can kind of see how, as you are turning into the turn, the forward acceleration, which means braking, is kind of the thing that everything is related to. Then you go into the turn, and you are having more of this lateral acceleration, and then again you are kind of starting to accelerate. Right? And again, I just kind of want to give you a quick vignette about how these methods can be used, and there are many other applications to stock market and so on. And if you want to learn more about this topic, we have 2 papers on these types of ideas here, both by David Halak, who's a student who's working on this. One is basically a longer version of what I just said on Wednesday, and the other one is even cooler technique. That's on Tuesday at 10 a.m. And here are where these talks are. So that's my idea number 2. So now I want to quickly talk about idea number 3, which is about how can you do machine learning on networks, and how can you automatically learn features of nodes in networks. Okay? So the idea is kind of the following. The basic machine learning problem of on a network is, can you predict colors or some kind of labels of nodes in a network, right? So the idea is, I give you this network, some of the nodes are labeled with colors, and these gray ones don't have colors, and I ask you, build a model that predicts the color. And right, you can start in your mind now saying, oh, what would be a good rule that says, what is the color of each of these nodes, and what is the network property of orange nodes that, right, and maybe the network property on this is that orange nodes have degree 1, so I will color this guy and that guy orange, and then let's say the violet nodes are all other nodes, or something like that, right? And here is maybe what I would want to get at the end. Right? But if you want to do this, then the basic thing is that you need features, right? If you want to train classifiers, every node you have to represent as a vector, as a set of features. So the question is, can these features be learned automatically? And this has been a very active area of research, both in the KDD community with lots of different works, starting with DeepWalk and then Line and GRAREP and so on, but also kind of the relational learning ICML community working on this quite a lot. So I want to give kind of almost like an overview and a sketch of one idea and how does one think of these things. So the idea is the following, right? What I want to do is I want to learn representations of nodes in a network. So I want to learn kind of efficient, task-independent feature learning in networks, so that then I can apply my favorite machine learning tool to the nodes of the network and do some prediction. So the idea is that for every node, you want to embed them in some d-dimensional space and think of this embedding as your feature representation of the node, and you'd like to do this in an automatic way. So one simple thing would be to say, oh, I'll just take the adjacency matrix and I'll factorize it and write using SVD or PCA or whatever you like, and then use those coordinates as embeddings. You can do that. It turns out it doesn't work too well, right? So these are kind of the methods that go beyond that, but you could think of SVD as feature learning for graphs. Okay, so the way we will do this is, rather than define this kind of global optimization problem in terms of singular value decomposition, we will define much more kind of localized objectives and then try to solve them and really think about how do I optimize positions or representations of nodes. So here is kind of the version 0, the basic intuition. The basic intuition to say, I want to find coordinates of a nodes in d dimensions so that I am able to preserve some notion of node similarity. Okay? I'm keeping this abstract, I'll make it concrete later, right? So the idea is that, right, I want to learn an embedding such that nodes that are nearby, nodes that are close in the network, they are also close, or they are embedded in the same part of the feature space. Okay, so the first thing that I need to do is, if I want to make the intuition precise, is to say, given a node, how do I define nearby nodes, right? And it turns out that, let's call these nearby nodes n of u, of node u, but the idea is that this neighborhood definition has to be flexible, because depending on what you want to do, you may want to have a different notion of this neighborhood. So for now, let's leave this notion of neighborhood abstract. Okay, so for every node, I have some other nodes who are the neighbors of that nodes. They are kind of close to this original node in the network. That's all what I mean about the neighborhood. Okay, so now that I have that, so how do I take this intuition and transform it into an optimization problem? The way I can do this is the following. I want to say, I want to find embedding, basically coordinates of every node u, so that I'm able to predict what are its neighbors, what are the nodes that are in its neighborhood. Okay, so here is the idea, right? I want to find f are coordinates of all my nodes, right? So basically, the number of parameters that I'm optimizing over is number of nodes times the number of dimensions. Those are my parameters, and what I want to do is I want to go over all nodes of the network, and given a current node u, I want to be able to predict who is in the neighborhood of that node. Okay, so I want to maximize this log probability given node u being able to predict who is its neighbor. And then I do two standard things. Here, this is a set of nodes, so I'm making this independence assumption and saying probability of a set given a node is simply a product over all the members of the set, given a node, predict its neighbor n. That's the first thing. Now I have to say, how do I make this prediction? And basically, I'm using this type of softmax function, where I'm saying probability of node n being a neighbor of u is basically the dot product of their coordinates exponentiated and then properly normalized. Okay, the way I've written this down here, this takes very long time to compute, but there are computational tricks to make this scale to compute much faster using negative sampling, and then you can scale this to networks of tens of millions of nodes. Okay, now basically I gave you the optimization problem. Here it is, right? I say find the coordinates of the nodes such that for every node I can predict who its neighbors are. And I can use stochastic gradient descent and start optimizing this function and basically just learn the coordinates directly. What I didn't tell you so far is one thing, which is how do I determine the neighborhood, this n? We left that unspecified. And what turns out is if you want to have good performance, you have to have a flexible notion of what the neighborhood is. So here I want to show you kind of the way we thought about it, and think about, you know, what are the two most extreme versions the way you could define a neighborhood. And one way to define the neighborhood would be something like to say, I'm given a fixed budget of how many neighbors can I generate, and now the question is, how do I explore the network to generate that size neighborhood? And one way to explore the network would be in this type of a breadth first search fashion, where basically I would go and try to look, you know, kind of locally around this node of interest u and say who are the neighbors, who are the nodes in its close proximity in the vicinity. That would be one kind of extreme network exploration strategy. Another one that would be, again, on the other extreme, would be depth first search type of exploration, where I'd say, I will start at this node, and then I'll just, you know, kind of do this depth first search, and I'll try to go as far away from node u as possible. And the interesting thing is that depending on how you explore the network, you will get a very different view of the network. If you explore the network in very kind of these small local patches around the starting node u, then you'll get a very local microscopic view of the network. But if you use this type of long-range exploration strategy, you will get a much better sense of how kind of the network looks like globally. You'll get more like a macroscopic view of the network. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to have an easy way to interpolate between these two extremes in some sense. We wanted to introduce some parameters that allow us to kind of explore the network in a BFS way, and, you know, if you change the parameters, you can get all the way to the DFS. So the way we do this is the following, right? Our goal is that for a given node, we want to generate this neighborhood n, and S is, I have S here because that's kind of the sampling strategy. How do I generate that? And we want to be flexible in order to do that. So the way we do this is that basically we introduce this biased random walk that starts at a given node and generates the neighborhood. So the idea will be, if you want to have a neighborhood of size 10, you will do a random walk of 10 steps and see what are the nodes you visit on the way. But this won't be kind of your standard Markov random walk. It will be a second order random walk. And the reason why it will be useful is because you will want to know where did you come from, so that you know whether you want to keep escaping away from where you came, or you want to kind of turn in and stay in the vicinity of where you came from. That's why it will have to be second order. Okay, so I'll have two parameters. I'll have a return parameter p, where the idea is I want to make a step back from where I came, and in-out parameter q that will say, do I want to kind of escape the vicinity of the node, or do I want to be close to the start? To give you an idea, here is how we think about it, right? Think that that u is my starting node, and that's where the random walk is. Then, according to the values of p and q, I set the weights of the edges. Okay, so the weight of the return edge will be 1 over p. The weight of the edge that kind of points away from the current node S4, I'll set that to be proportional to 1 over q, and then all the other edges will have weight 1. Okay, and now basically the way I can think about it is that right now the random walker is here and it will flip a biased coin, and according to these probabilities, normalized of course, it will make it its next step, right? And for example, if I have a low value of p, it means I won't be returning back from where I came from, so I will be either staying at the same distance from node u, or I will take a step away from it. And if I will have a low value of q, this means this edge weight will be high. This means basically that I'll be walking away from node u. Okay, so depending on p and q, I can force the random walker to just kind of walk straight away from u and be almost like a depth first search type thing. Or if I have high value of q and low value of p, then in some sense I can force the walk to just kind of stay in the local neighborhood of u, and this way generate the neighborhoods. Okay, so what's the algorithm? The algorithm is, first you wanna, in a pre-processing phase, you wanna compute these random walk transition probabilities, and then for every node u, you wanna simulate r random walks of length L, and this gives you now the neighborhoods. And now that for every node you have those neighborhoods, you can execute that optimization equation that tries to predict who are the nodes in your neighborhood from the coordinates of the nodes. And this way you can learn the coordinates. All this is linear time complexity, and each of these three steps is individually parallelizable. So you can kind of run this well. I want to show one application of this thing. And in particular, this application will be to biological networks, to predicting protein function. So proteins are these worker molecules in cells, and they kind of go around and they physically get together to do something useful in the cell. And understanding what proteins do is important for biomedical applications, for pharmaceutical applications, and so on. And in particular, what is interesting is that the function of a protein is not the same across different cells of your body. So basically, the function of the protein is dependent of which tissue the given cell comes from. Okay? So the way we will think of this is we will think of the following. We'll say here are different tissues, right? Lung, heart, brain, those are all different tissues. And for each tissue, we will have a tissue-specific protein-protein interaction network. Okay, each network will have the same set of proteins, but interactions will be different because they are tissue specific. But then I will also have a hierarchy of how these tissues are related to each other. So I will have, and I will connect this into one giant network. So I'll have this kind of multi-scale layered networks, if you want, if you want to think of it that way. For every tissue, I have a separate network, and then these networks are connected into a hierarchy depending on kind of biological relationship between the tissues. Now what I can do is I can use the method I just talked about, but just extend it a bit. And the way I can extend it a bit is to introduce this kind of hierarchical regularization, right? Basically where the idea is that for every node in every layer, I wanna learn its representation based on the network neighborhood in that layer. But then what I want to also say is that the position of node u in layer I should be close to the position of that node in the parent layer, right? So for example, I'm learning the positions of the nodes here at the leaves, but then I'm also kind of saying I will also learn some kind of fake representation of a node u in the inner element of the tree, such that this thing is in some sense some kind of average of the positions in the children layers. Okay, and this way I can now start and share information across the layers and infer faithful tissue-specific embeddings, where the embedding of a node here is both the function of its network neighborhood plus some kind of regularization of the embedding of the same node in other layers or other tissues. So the idea is now that I will learn embeddings of the nodes in all the layers. I want to use this node to back objective that I had before in terms of learning the embedding in every layer, but then I want to also have this hierarchical dependency objective, something like this, that regularizes embeddings across layers. And I want to show you how well this works.
right? So the experiment here is with on 107 tissue-specific protein-protein interaction networks. So basically, I have this kind of hierarchy. Here is just one part of it for brain, and you can kind of see different tissues of the brain and how this is organized. But the hierarchy we have has 107 nodes, where tissues being at the leaves of this hierarchy. And then for each protein can be labeled with one or more of almost like 600 different tissue-specific cellular functions, right? So for example, here's an example of the label where I say, in this particular tissue, this is a particular function the protein can have. And in this particular tissue, other tissue, right, an artery, here is a different function some protein can have. So the question is, how well does this work? And compared to the state of the art of what they can do in bioinformatics, we are able to improve our state of the art baselines by around 42% to give these accurate predictions in terms of tissue-specific protein function. And these are different tissues, and here is our score, and you see in some it works really well, and in some it does a bit less. Another thing these things allow us to do, if I go back, it allows us to do transfer learning. So what it allows us to do is to learn an embedding of a tissue that we have never seen. And we can then transfer the labels from other tissues to that unknown tissue. And this becomes very important as biologists get more samples. They want to be able to make predictions in a kind of brand new, uncharacterized tissue, and this allows you to do this type of transfer learning. How do the embeddings we learn, how do they look like? For example, if you take the learned embedding and then project it down to 2 dimensions using t-SNE, here I showed you before the hierarchical network for the brain. Here are what I do here is for every node, for every protein is a dot. These are its 2-dimensional coordinates as using dimensionality reduction from the features we learn, and I color them based on which tissue that protein is at. And you see how we basically learn different in some sense anatomically relevant features for nodes in different tissues. So that's what I wanted to say about feature learning in graphs. Right now, what we are working on is we are working on very different set of approaches which are based on graph convolution networks. I won't say more, I just have kind of one slide. There is a paper we have on archive called GraphSage that will likely be accepted soon. And the idea here is that the way we think of this is that rather than saying, I want to predict my neighbors, what you want to do is to say, every of my neighbors has some features, already has some coordinates assigned. And what do I want to do is I want to be able to learn how to aggregate my neighbor's coordinates into my own coordinates. Right? And this way you are kind of aggregating information 1 hop away, 2 hop away to learn the representation of a given node. And what is nice about this is that this can be done in a supervised way, while kind of node to end we were doing in an unsupervised way. Okay? Great. So this is number 3. I have one more. So number 4, I want to talk about kind of doing module detection and uncovering modular structure in networks. And this will be kind of an interesting spin on graph partitioning, where rather than partitioning edges of the network, we'll try to partition higher order structures of the network. Okay, so that's the idea. So here's how to think about this, right? If you look at networks are not just sets of nodes and edges, but there are these kind of intermediate or small level substructures. Here are examples of different triangles in the network that are very important for the function of these networks. And for example, in social networks, we know that triadic closure is one of the main forces that shapes the evolution and the structure of social networks. So in social networks, we know triangles are important. In protein interaction networks, for example, some four-node substructures are very important. In neural networks, you have this kind of feed-forward loops that become very important for the function of these networks. Right? So the question then becomes, how can I understand the organization of networks at the level of these types of subgraphs? And how do I extract organization at the level of subgraphs. Okay? So basically the idea is, can I go and cluster the network based on a given subgraph? Okay? So here's the simple idea. If you give me this particular subgraph and tell to me, I want to find parts of the network where there is lots of this particular subgraph, right? Like a bidirectional edge at the bottom and kind of two edges pointing from top to the bottom, right? Then if this is the network you give me, then here are the two instances, I color them, of that particular structure that you are interested in. So the cluster you want to identify is that cluster. And notice that in traditional sense, this is a really bad cluster, right? It cuts all these edges, there's nothing kind of clustery about it. But if this is the structure you are interested in, then this is the cluster you should identify. Of course, if you give me a different structure, let's say this particular triangle that now has two bidirectional edges and one unidirectional edge, then the clusters you identify should be different. Here are the clusters you should identify, because this is the substructure that we are interested in, right? So the question becomes, can I design principled algorithms that allow me to identify clusters based not just on density of the edges, but the density of the motif of a subgraph of interest, okay? So the way we will do this is the following. We will start with a quick review, and then we'll of how graph partitioning is traditionally thought of, and then we'll generalize this to notion of not partitioning edges, but partitioning motifs, partitioning subgraphs. Okay? The way you usually do partitioning is to come up with an objective function and basically try to separate the nodes of the graph into sets such that some objective function is optimized. And a very classical objective function that is basically the heart of the spectral graph theory and spectral graph partitioning, it's called conductance. And the idea is the following. I want to find an objective function, kind of a quality metric for a given set of nodes S. And the question is, how, if you give me a set of nodes S, how do I quantify whether this is a good cluster or a bad cluster? And what conductance says, it's based on this idea that if you give me a set of nodes S, then what do I want? I want lots of edges to be between the members of the set S. So I want to have lots of edges inside the set between the members, and I want to have a few edges that point outside the set. So I want to kind of cut as few edges as possible. And the way you can combine this to kind of by criteria into one number is to compute conductance, which is the number of edges I cut. This would be 2 in this case, divided by the volume of the cluster. And the volume is simply the number of edge endpoints in S. So it's basically twice the sum of the degrees of the nodes in the set S. Okay? This is now over individual edges, right? To be able to do conductance over individual edges, I have to specify number of edges that I cut, I have to specify the volume, and then I take the ratio. So now how would I generalize this to subgraphs, to motifs? And the generalization is very natural, right? Rather than saying how many edges do I cut, I now ask how many motifs of interest do I cut, right? If I'm interested in triangles, here is an example how triangle can be cut, right? 2 nodes belong to the cluster and 1 node does not belong to the cluster, for example, and we are cutting the motif. Then I can also generalize the notion of volume, whether to say number of edge endpoints in S, I can say this is the number of motif endpoints in S. And then, the same as in conductance, I can take the ratio of these two quantities, and I have now the notion of kind of motif-based or this higher order conductance. Right? So let me give you an example what this means. Right? So if I have a network and I have a motif of interest down there on the left, then let's say what is the conductance of this given cut S, right? So I say what is the conductance of this set S. So the way I would compute this is first identify, I need to count how many motifs do I cut and what is the motif volume of set S. So here I'm showing you all the instances of this network structure. So here are all the instances of this motif. So what's the value of my conductance? I'm cutting one instance of the motif. And now what is my motif volume? My motif volume will be 10, because 10 is the number of endpoints of the motifs inside set S. Why 10? Here are 3 instances of my motif. that's 3 times 3, and then there is also this instance that has one endpoint in my set S. So it's 9 plus 1, it's 10. So the motif conductance for this set S is 1 over 10. Right? So now I know what I want to do. I want to go and identify clusters of motifs where you are giving me a motif and a graph, and I want to find a cluster S that minimizes motif conductance as we just defined. The question is, what's the algorithm to do this? The point is that doing this is empty hard, but we have kind of a generalization of spectral clustering that allows us to obtain near optimal clusters. And the way we do this is the following. We'll take our original graph G, and we'll transform it to a new weighted graph W, and then on this weighted graph W we will perform the old style spectral clustering, but then we will have a theorem that says that whatever are the clusters we obtain on this new graph W are actually near optimal with respect to the graph G and motif M that we are interested in. So let me now explain you how this will work. So there are 3 steps to the algorithm. So the first step is that we want to take this graph G and transform it into another graph W. And the way we will do this transformation is that we'll take the graph G, that in this case is a directed graph, and transform it into a weighted graph W. And the weight of every edge in this graph will be the number of times a particular edge appears in a motif of this type, that is the motif we are given to us by the user. Right? So for this particular graph, here is the weighted version of that graph. Okay? So now, because this is weighted undirected graph, where every edge has a weight. And you can ask, why does this edge here have weight 2? That's the edge there, and the reason it has weight 2, if I look at the instances of this particular motif in my original network, that particular edge 8, 9 participates in 2 instances of that motif, right? 2 instances of my triangle. So there's a weight 2. Similarly, you can ask, why does this edge have weight 1? It has weight 1 because it participates in 1 instance of my triangle. For example, this bottom edge here, between 7 and 9, it doesn't participate in any instance of my motif, so that edge has weight 0, so it's not in the graph anymore. Okay? But all I do is I take my weighted graph and I transform, my original graph, and I transform it into a weighted undirected graph. And this way I have this weighted adjacency matrix W here. What I can do then is take this weighted adjacency matrix and just run old style spectral clustering with it. So basically I form the graph Laplacian matrix, and then I find the eigenvector that corresponds to the second eigenvalue of that Laplacian matrix. And what I can then do is basically I can think of this eigenvector as assigning a value to every node of the network, right? The dimensionality of that eigenvector is the number of nodes in the network. So I can think of every coordinate of that vector as a label, as a value for every node of the network. And what I can do now is I can order my nodes based on their coordinate in the eigenvector. And then what I can do is I can start at the beginning and explore these nested sets, where basically I say, let me take the first R nodes in the eigenvector and proclaim those a cluster, and then ask what is the quality, what's the motif conductance of the first R nodes according to the values of the eigenvector. And now I can keep expanding along the eigenvector and measure the quality of the cluster. And generally these things will look like this, and I'm asking what's the local minima of this curve. And wherever this curve reaches the local minima, that's the cluster I detect. Okay? And what do we have? We have a theorem that this particular algorithm finds a cluster of nodes S, which is near optimal. Basically, what this says is that if I know what is the best cluster I can find in my network, which is empty hard to find at the first place, I have a guarantee that the cluster this method I just showed you will find is near optimal. So it's a quadratic factor away from the optimal one that's empty hard to find. Right? So what did we do is 2 things. First, we have now generalization of clustering our graph partitioning to higher order structures, to network motifs, and we have a scalable algorithm that gives us a quality or an approximation guarantee on the quality of clusters we obtain. And I want to give you one example how this works. What's the application of this? So the application here is food webs, okay? Food webs are networks where every node is an animal and two nodes are connected if these two animals are exchanging carbon, which is just a fancy word for saying I'm eating you. Okay, so it's just basically which animal is eating which other animal. And if one animal is preying on the other animal, it takes the carbon stored in that animal and kind of consumes it. Okay, what is interesting is that basically this captures how the energy is flowing through the ecosystem. And in particular here we will look at the marine ecosystem in some bay in Florida, where biologists would go in and hand map all this relationship of which organism, which animal is preying on which other organism. And these different motifs that I show you at the bottom, they are basically they are important because they capture how the energy flows across the ecosystem. So the question becomes, how is this food web organized? What is the structure of this particular ecosystem? So in our language, the question is which motif organizes the food web, right? And the way we will do this is that we will run our method for each of the 13 different motifs, different triangles, directed triangles. And then we will see which of these different motifs gives us the best clustering. So just to give you an idea, right, I was showing before, I said here are the sets S, this is the conductance, lower is better. Here I'm showing you just examples of 3 different motifs and how good clusters we find. And you see that, for example, we don't find 2 good clusters with motifs M8 and M5, but this motif M6 gives us really, really good clusters. Okay, so there seems to be something going on with this motif M6. So what is the observation? The observation is that this network organizes based on motif M6 and not M5 or M8 or any other motif. And if you look at, for example, what do the clusters that you identify using this motif M6, what do they correspond to? Here are the clusters that we identify, and they correspond to what is known as aquatic layers, right? This is a marine ecosystem, so kind of the ecosystem organizes in these layers based on the sunlight that's coming from the top. And we can identify these aquatic layers in a totally unsupervised way, basically 20% better than previous methods were able to identify. And what is interesting is that now you can go into these individual clusters that I showed up here and examine their structure. And what you see is this kind of beautiful templated structure composed of this motif M6, right? Here is M6, and now if you take it, kind of rotate it counterclockwise 90 degrees, you see it here, right? Here's the bidirectional edge from the bottom, and then these are all the unidirectional edges, right? So basically, we see that is an aquatic layer, and the structure it has is basically animals preying in the layer, preying each other, and then also preying on something that is above them, right? And the carbon going downwards. That's one cluster. Here's another cluster, and again, you can see the same structure. Here, the bidirectional edges are here, and then these are the 2 unidirectional edges of the motif. Okay. And at this KDD, we are showing about how to take this idea and apply it to local graph partition. So basically, if you have graphs that are so huge that you don't wanna, and you wanna cluster them, but you want your clustering algorithm not to need to explore the entire graph. So the idea is to build algorithms that only explore local part of the graph to identify the cluster of that part. Okay, and this is on Wednesday at 4 p.m. So let me conclude. So in this talk, I want to give a high-level overview of 4 different things. How we compute our networks and kind of what's the software infrastructure our group is using to do all our research. Then I talked about inferring and building networks. I talked about how do you do machine learning and feature learning on graphs. And then I talked about this idea of network partitioning using network motifs. So with this, Let me finish here. The slides will be posted on the website. Here are all the references with pointers to the code. I'd like to thank all our partners and all the students who were working on this. And as I said, we are looking for postdocs, so let me know. Thank you very much.